Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. There are children born under ordinary skies, and then there are children born when the universe itself is celebrating. Sage arrived on the night of the Perseid meteor shower, when the darkness bloomed with falling stars, and the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. The midwife later claimed she saw something impossible, tiny lights dancing around the newborn's cradle, no bigger than fireflies, but warm as summer afternoons. Elena held her daughter for the first time, while meteors painted silver streaks across the lighthouse windows, and she felt something shift in the very fabric of their small world. The baby's cry wasn't the sharp wail most newborns make, but something softer, almost musical, as if she were trying to harmonize with a song only she could hear. Marcus, who had spent his life tending the lighthouse beam that guided ships safely home, looked at his daughter and understood that they would now be guiding something far more precious through the darkness. The first sign came when Sage was 3 months old. Elena was exhausted, walking the floors with a colicky baby who seemed inconsolable, when suddenly Sage stopped crying and began to giggle, her tiny hands reaching toward empty air as if trying to catch something beautiful. Elena followed her daughter's gaze and saw nothing, but she felt it, a warmth, a presence, something kind and ancient and impossibly gentle settling over them like the softest blanket. "What do you see, little star?" Elena whispered, and though Sage couldn't speak yet, her continued laughter seemed to say everything beautiful that her parents couldn't quite remember how to see. As Sage grew from infant to toddler, the invisible presence became woven into the fabric of their daily life. She would share her toys with someone who wasn't there, offer bites of her food to invisible companions, and sometimes fall asleep, curled against what looked like nothing but felt, to anyone who sat nearby, remarkably like the warmth of a beloved pet. The lighthouse itself seemed to embrace this gentle mystery, its rooms filling with an unusual warmth that visitors would comment upon, saying the place felt different somehow, more peaceful, as if the very walls held secrets of contentment. Elena found herself humming lullabies she didn't remember learning, melodies that seemed to rise from somewhere deep and ancient, while Marcus discovered that his practical nature could easily accommodate the impossible when it brought such obvious joy to his daughter. They would catch glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision, sense a benevolent presence watching over their family with protective tenderness, and they learned not to question what they couldn't fully understand. The other children in town were fascinated by Sage's invisible companion. Unlike adults, who often dismissed what they couldn't see, the children seemed to sense that something wonderful was happening in the lighthouse. They would gather around Sage during playtime, listening with rapt attention as she described her friend's gentle nature, her shimmering presence, her quiet wisdom about the beauty hidden in ordinary moments. It wasn't until Sage turned 4 that she finally offered a complete explanation, delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess when discussing the impossible. She was sitting at the kitchen table, carefully drawing what appeared to be a small, luminous creature, surrounded by floating bubbles of light, each one containing tiny scenes of joy and laughter. "Ember lives here too," she announced to her parents, not looking up from her drawing. "She's a dragon, but she's not scary like in the old stories. She's about the size of our cat, and her scales change colors like the ocean does when the sun sets. She collects happy things instead of gold." Marcus set down his evening weather report and looked at his daughter's earnest face. The drawing was remarkably detailed for a 4-year-old, showing not just the creature, but what appeared to be a constellation of preserved moments floating around her like captured stars. "What kind of happy things?" he asked, genuinely curious about the rich world his daughter inhabited. Sage considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, selecting a golden crayon to add more light to her drawing. "Like when you laugh so hard your belly hurts and happy tears come out, and the smell of Mama's bread when it's still warm from the oven, and the feeling when you hug someone and they hug you back just exactly right, like puzzle pieces fitting together perfectly. She keeps them safe in special bubbles so they don't get lost or forgotten when people are sad." Elena, who had been listening from the doorway while folding laundry, felt tears prick her eyes. In a world that seemed determined to forget its own beauty, her daughter had found a guardian of joy itself, a keeper of all the moments that made life worth living. That evening, as the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across the darkening water, the family sat together in their kitchen, sharing soup and sandwiches cut into triangles. Sage chattered happily about Ember's day, describing how the dragon had helped the baker remember the exact taste of his grandmother's cinnamon rolls, and how she had returned the sound of ocean waves to a neighbor who had been too worried to hear them properly. "She doesn't keep the happy things for herself," Sage explained, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "She's like a library but for feelings. People can borrow what they need when they forget how to smile." Marcus reached across the table to touch his daughter's hand, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow through her as naturally as breath. "That sounds like very important work," he said softly. "It is," Sage nodded solemnly. "And someday when I'm bigger, I'm going to help her do it." Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its eternal promise to guide travelers safely home, while inside, a small family settled into sleep, knowing they shared their world with something infinitely gentle and wise. A dragon who hoarded not treasure, but the precious moments that made their hearts remember how to be. Light, the promise Sage made that evening, settled into the rhythm of their lighthouse life like a gentle tide finding its natural shore. As she grew from 4 to 7, the partnership between girl and dragon deepened with the patient unfolding of seasons, each day bringing new understanding of the delicate work they shared. Growing up with an invisible dragon for a best friend taught Sage things that no classroom could offer. She learned that happiness had weight and texture, that laughter came in different colors, and that the most precious treasures were often the ones people forgot they possessed. Ember, as Sage described her with increasing detail, was exactly the size of a house cat, with scales that shifted color like oil on water, and eyes that held the warmth of every sunset that had ever painted the sky above their lighthouse. "She's not invisible," Sage would patiently explain to anyone who suggested otherwise, her voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "You just have to look with the right part of your eyes. The part that remembers being little and believing in magic before anyone told you it wasn't real." The dragon's hoard was unlike anything from the old fairy tales Marcus read at bedtime. Instead of gold coins piled high in caverns, Ember's collection consisted of what Sage called memory bubbles, shimmering, iridescent spheres that floated gently around the dragon like the most beautiful constellation ever imagined. Each bubble contained a perfect moment, preserved in crystalline clarity, the exact feeling of a mother's hand smoothing back your hair when you had a fever, the sound of your father's laugh when he thought no one was listening, the taste of the first strawberry of summer, warm from the sun and sweet with promise. When Sage concentrated very hard, especially during the golden hour just before sunset, when the lighthouse windows caught fire with reflected light, she could see the entire collection. There was the warm, honey-gold glow of a child's first successful bicycle ride, wobbling yet triumphant. The soft, blue-gray shimmer of a whispered secret, shared between old friends under starlit sky. The vibrant green of a gardener's pride in a perfectly blooming rose, and the deep, comforting warmth of a mother's embrace after a long day. "I don't collect them," Ember explained one afternoon, her voice like wind chimes made of starlight. "They come to me when people are ready to share, when they're so full of joy it overflows. Every time someone laughs with pure delight, every time someone feels completely loved, a little bubble of that feeling breaks free and finds its way to dragons like me. We're not thieves of happiness, we're librarians of joy." This revelation changed everything for Sage. She began to understand that different types of joy had different textures, different colors, different weights. The bright, effervescent happiness of surprise felt completely different from the deep, quiet contentment of belonging. Ember taught her to distinguish these nuances through gentle guidance, feelings that flowed directly into Sage's heart like warm honey spreading through her veins. Her first real attempt at helping came when she was 6. Old Mr. Henderson, a retired fisherman who lived down the lane, had lost his beloved cat Mackerel. The gruff man rarely showed emotion, but Sage could see the grey cloud that clung to him, a heavy shroud of quiet sorrow that made even sunny days feel dim around his shoulders. "He's forgotten the purr," Ember whispered, nudging Sage gently toward understanding. Clutching a smooth beach stone for courage, Sage approached Mr. Henderson as he sat on his porch, staring out at the restless sea with empty eyes. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice small but clear, "Ember says you've forgotten the purr." The old man looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. "What are you talking about, child?" "Mackerel's purr," Sage clarified, echoing Ember's whispered guidance. "The one that vibrated through your chest when he slept on your lap. The sound that felt like everything was warm and safe, even when storms were raging outside." As she spoke, Ember gently released a tiny, shimmering bubble from her collection. It drifted toward Mr. Henderson, like a soap bubble carried on a breeze that existed only in the spaces between ordinary moments. When it touched him, his stern face softened. A faint tremor passed through his chest, and his eyes held a faraway tenderness he thought he'd lost forever. He didn't speak, but a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, not a tear of fresh grief but of rediscovered love. A quiet acknowledgement that the comfort he'd feared was gone forever had simply been waiting to be remembered. That evening, Sage watched from her window as Mr. Henderson sat on his porch again, but this time he wasn't staring blankly. He was gently stroking the empty space on his lap, a faint, contented smile playing on his lips, as if he could still feel the phantom weight of mackerel, still hear the echo of a purr that had been returned to him. Joy shared is joy multiplied. Ember's warmth resonated in Sage's mind like a gentle lullaby. These treasures belong to everyone who needs them. And in that quiet moment, under the watchful gaze of the lighthouse beam, Sage understood that her childhood promise was already becoming reality. Unfolding into a gentle path, she was destined to walk alongside her dragon friend, helping the world remember how to shine. The success with Mr. Henderson rippled through their small coastal town like gentle waves finding new shores, each person touched by his quiet transformation, carrying the story forward in their own way. Mrs. Chen from the bakery mentioned that the old fisherman had started visiting again, ordering his usual blueberry muffins, but now lingering to chat about the weather and the fishing reports, with a warmth that seemed to surprise even him. The postman noticed he'd begun tending his garden again, planting catnip near the front steps, with the tender care of someone honoring a beloved memory. But it was Sage who understood the deeper truth of what had happened. She had witnessed the exact moment when a forgotten treasure was returned to its rightful owner, had felt the gentle power that flowed through Ember's work, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of something far more beautiful than she had imagined. As Sage moved through her 8th and 9th years, the partnership between girl and dragon evolved into something more sophisticated, more intentional. Ember began teaching her to distinguish between different types of emotional wounds, different categories of forgotten joy. Some people had simply misplaced their happiness, like keys left in yesterday's coat pocket. Others had buried their capacity for delight so deeply under layers of disappointment and pain that excavation required infinite patience and delicate care. Every person carries their own constellation of joy, Ember explained during one of their evening lessons, her form shimmering with accumulated warmth from the day's gentle interventions. Some stars shine brightly and are easy to see. Others have been dimmed by clouds of sorrow or fear. Our work is not to create new light, but to help people remember the light that was always there. Sage learned to practice a new kind of listening, one that went far beyond hearing words. She would sit quietly in the town square, watching people pass by, and with Ember's guidance she began to sense the underlying currents of their emotions. A woman bustling past with a basket of groceries might project an aura of efficiency, but Sage could feel the faint tremor of loneliness around her heart. A group of teenagers laughing loudly might seem carefree, but she could discern the fragile thread of insecurity holding their bravado together. It was like learning to read a secret language, written not in words but in feelings, in the subtle shifts of light and shadow around a person's spirit. Ember taught her that some people hide their deepest sorrows behind their brightest masks, that to truly help, she must learn to see beyond the surface, to feel the ripple beneath the calmest waters. The most significant test of these growing abilities came when Sage was 10, during the autumn when the lighthouse keeper's daughter truly began to understand the weight and wonder of her calling. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store with crisp efficiency and an even crisper demeanor, had been struggling for weeks. Most people in town assumed she was simply having a difficult time with the accounts, or perhaps dealing with a particularly troublesome supplier. But Sage could sense something much deeper. There was a profound sadness that clung to Mrs. Patterson like persistent fog, making her movements stiff and her smile brittle. When Sage helped her mother with the weekly shopping, she watched the older woman move through her tasks with mechanical precision, but her eyes held a distant emptiness that spoke of something precious lost. "She's forgotten how to dance," Ember whispered one afternoon as they observed Mrs. Patterson through the store window. Her movements efficient but joyless as she arranged canned goods with mathematical precision. That evening, after the store had closed and the last customer had departed, Sage found herself drawn back to the quiet building. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Patterson meticulously wiping down counters that were already spotless. Her motions precise but somehow desperate, as if she were trying to clean away something that couldn't be reached with soap and water. Gathering her courage, Sage knocked gently on the door. Mrs. Patterson looked up, surprised to see the lighthouse keeper's daughter standing in the gathering dusk. "Mrs. Patterson," Sage began quietly, the words feeling both strange and perfectly natural on her tongue. "Ember says you've lost something important." The older woman paused, her cleaning cloth hovering over an imaginary smudge. She looked at Sage with tired eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated weariness. "I don't know what you mean, dear. I haven't lost anything." "A memory," Sage continued, guided by Ember's gentle nudging, a feeling of music and movement flowing through her awareness. "Something about dancing, about music that made your heart sing, about feeling young and beautiful and completely free, like you could spin forever and the whole world would spin with you." Mrs. Patterson's carefully composed face began to crumble, like a dam finally giving way after holding back years of accumulated pressure. Her eyes filled with tears that seemed to come from a place she had forgotten existed, a reservoir of joy that had been locked away for so long she had convinced herself it was gone forever. "I used to dance," she whispered, her voice thick with rediscovered emotion. "My husband George. Before he got sick, before the store became everything, before my arthritis made every step ache, we used to clear out the living room furniture and put on the old gramophone. He would take my hand, and we would waltz until we were dizzy with laughter. I felt like I could fly in his arms, like we were the only two people in the world who understood the secret language of music." Sage felt Ember move beside her, felt the dragon reach into her vast shimmering hoard and select something infinitely precious, a bubble of pure joy that glowed like captured starlight, holding within it the exact feeling of being young and in love and moving to music that seemed to come from the very heartbeat of the universe. As the memory bubble drifted toward Mrs. Patterson like the gentlest blessing, the woman's face transformed completely. For one perfect moment she was young again, spinning in her husband's arms, her head thrown back in pure delight, her feet moving to a rhythm that lived in her bones and had never truly been forgotten. "I remember," she breathed, and the genuine smile that graced her lips was soft and tender and full of wonder. "I remember how it felt to be truly, completely happy." From that day forward, Mrs. Patterson moved through her store with a different energy entirely. She hummed old melodies while she worked, and customers began to linger, drawn by the warmth that seemed to radiate from her renewed spirit. She even started playing music during store hours, soft waltzes that made people smile without quite knowing why. That night, as Sage walked home under a sky dusted with stars, she understood that her gift wasn't just seeing Ember. It was helping others remember their own capacity for joy, their own connection to the magic that lived in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before laughter, in the moment when someone suddenly recalls what it feels like to be alive and grateful and completely, wonderfully human. The lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across the darkening water, and Sage knew that more people would find their way to them. Drawn by something they couldn't quite name but desperately needed, she was ready to listen, ready to help them remember the treasures they thought they had lost forever. The transformation in Mrs. Patterson's general store became a quiet beacon that drew others from the shadows of their own forgotten joys. Word spread through their coastal town not as gossip, but as something more profound, a whispered understanding that healing was possible, that the lighthouse keeper's daughter possessed a gift that could help people remember pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. As Sage moved through her 11th and 12th years, people began arriving at the lighthouse with careful steps and hopeful eyes, carrying sorrows they couldn't quite name. They would sit in Elena's warm kitchen, hands wrapped around cups of tea they barely touched, and speak in halting voices about feelings that had slipped away like morning mist. Some had simply misplaced their capacity for wonder, while others had buried it so deeply beneath layers of disappointment that excavation required infinite patience and the gentlest touch. Ember's collection had grown more sophisticated during these years, organized not just by the color and texture of different joys, but by the specific emotional needs they served. There were bubbles that held the fierce pride of overcoming obstacles, perfect for those who had forgotten their own strength. Others contained the gentle contentment of quiet moments, shared with loved ones, ideal for people who had lost their capacity for simple peace. Each treasure waited in shimmering suspension, ready to be returned to its rightful owner when the moment was exactly right. Timing, Ember explained during one of their evening conversations, her form rippling with accumulated warmth from the day's gentle interventions, is as important as the gift itself. Some hearts need to be prepared slowly, like soil being readied for planting. Others are ready to bloom the moment they remember what light feels like. This deeper understanding was tested when Tom Bradley sought them out during the grey months of winter. Tom was a fisherman whose weathered hands knew every current and tide around their coast, but something essential had gone out of him when his teenage son left for college in the distant city. The boy's departure had been natural, even celebrated, but Tom carried the absence like a physical weight, his shoulders bent under the burden of an empty house and a future that felt suddenly purposeless. "I know this might sound foolish," Tom began, his voice rough with disuse, "but I can't remember why I love the sea anymore. I go out every morning because it's what I do, what my family has always done, but the joy has gone out of it completely. When my boy was little, he used to come with me and everything felt like an adventure. Now it just feels like work, endless and grey as winter fog." Sage could see the problem immediately, guided by Ember's gentle wisdom flowing through her awareness like warm honey. Tom hadn't lost his love for the ocean. He had confused it with his love for sharing that experience with his son. The two feelings had become so intertwined that when one was no longer available, he couldn't access the other. It was like trying to remember a favorite song when you could only recall the harmony, having forgotten the melody that gave it meaning. "Tell me about the very first time you fell in love with the water," Sage asked softly, feeling Ember's encouragement warming the space between them. Tom's weathered face softened as he reached back through decades of memory, his eyes growing distant with remembering. "I was maybe 7 years old. My grandfather took me out before dawn, and when the sun came up, it turned the whole ocean into liquid gold. I felt like we were sailing through heaven itself. The boat was rocking so gently, and I could hear my grandfather humming an old sea shanty under his breath. And I remember thinking that this was the most beautiful thing I would ever see in my entire life." As he spoke, Sage could sense Ember moving through her vast collection, searching with the patience of someone who understood that the perfect treasure was worth waiting for. The dragon paused at a bubble that glowed with the warm gold of sunrise, shot through with threads of pure wonder and the deep security of being loved and protected by someone infinitely wise and patient. "That feeling," Sage said quietly, "of being surrounded by beauty so vast, it made you feel both tiny and infinite at the same time. Of understanding that you belong to something larger than yourself, something ancient and eternal and completely trustworthy." The memory bubble drifted toward Tom like a blessing made visible. And when it touched him, his entire posture changed. His shoulders straightened, his eyes brightened with unshed tears, and for one perfect moment he was 7 years old again, sailing through liquid gold with someone he loved, discovering that the world was far more beautiful than he had ever dared to imagine. "I remember," he whispered, and his voice carried the same wonder it had held all those decades ago. "I remember falling in love with the morning light on the water, with the way the boat felt like a living thing beneath my feet, with the sense that every single day on the ocean was a gift I got to unwrap." From that day forward, Tom's relationship with the sea was transformed. He still missed his son, still felt the natural ache of a parent watching a child grow into independence, but he could once again experience the ocean as his first love, his constant companion, his source of daily renewal. He began taking photographs during his fishing trips, sending them to his son with messages about the beauty he was witnessing, sharing his rediscovered wonder rather than his loneliness. More significantly, Tom became one of the first adults to speak openly about what Sage had done for him. He told other fishermen about the lighthouse keeper's daughter, who could help you remember things you thought you'd lost forever. And gradually, a network of quiet understanding began to spread through their community, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. As winter gave way to spring, Sage found herself working with more people than ever before, each case teaching her something new about the delicate art of emotional restoration. She learned that healing was not about creating something new, but about removing the barriers that prevented people from accessing the joy that had always been there. Waiting patiently in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before laughter, in the moment when someone suddenly remembers what it feels like to be completely, wonderfully alive. Through it all, Ember remained her constant teacher and guide, but as the days grew longer and warmer, Sage began to notice subtle changes in her beloved friend. Shifts that would soon challenge everything she thought she understood about love, loss, and the nature of bonds that transcend the visible world. The network of quiet, understanding that had begun with Mrs. Patterson's renewed dancing spirit, and Tom Bradley's rediscovered love for the sea continued to spread through their coastal town like gentle ripples finding new shores. As Sage moved through her 13th year, more people began arriving at the lighthouse with careful steps and hopeful eyes, carrying sorrows they couldn't quite name, but somehow knew she might be able to help them understand. It was during this time of increased visitors that Sage first noticed the subtle changes in Ember. The haiga, dragon's edges seemed softer somehow, less defined, as if her scales were slowly becoming more like warm breath than solid form. When Ember leaped from the windowsill to curl beside Sage during their evening conversations, the familiar weight against her side felt lighter, more like the memory of warmth than warmth itself. The collection of joy-filled bubbles that floated around the dragon remained as vibrant as ever, but they drifted higher than usual, clinging to the rafters like gentle lanterns that had forgotten about gravity. "Are you feeling different?" Sage asked one evening, reaching out to stroke Ember's head as she had done countless times before. Her hand passed through what should have been solid scales, meeting only the softest resistance, like touching mist that held the echo of a beloved pet. "I'm changing," Ember replied, her voice carrying the same warmth but with a new quality, as if she were speaking from a slightly greater distance. "It's what happens to all of us eventually, when we've held so much love and joy that we begin to become more energy than form. Don't be afraid, little keeper. This is not an ending, it's a transformation." The words sent a flutter of worry through Sage's heart. But before she could dwell on what Ember's changes might mean, their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the lighthouse door. Eleanor answered to find a young woman about Sage's age, with dark hair escaping from a hastily tied ponytail and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Oliver Chen, Mrs. Chen's niece. I'm staying with her for the summer to help at the bakery while she recovers from her injury." She said maybe Sage could help me with something I can't really explain. Sage appeared at her mother's shoulder, immediately sensing the gentle sadness that clung to Oliver like morning fog. But there was something else, something familiar about the way Oliver seemed to perceive the emotional atmosphere around her, the way her eyes lingered on empty spaces, as if she could almost see something just beyond the edge of vision. "I keep having dreams," Oliver continued as they settled in the warm kitchen with cups of Elena's chamomile tea. "Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where I'm searching for something I've lost. I wake up feeling like I've forgotten something important, something that used to make me happy, but I can't remember what it was." Sage felt Ember stir beside her, the dragon's attention focusing on Oliver with the gentle intensity of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. "Tell me about the last time you remember feeling truly happy," Sage said softly, guided by Ember's whispered encouragement. Oliver's face grew thoughtful, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "I was maybe 10 years old, visiting my grandmother in the city. She had this tiny apartment, but she'd filled every windowsill with plants, and in the morning the whole place would be full of green light. She would make me breakfast and tell me stories about when she was young, and I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, like I was part of something beautiful and ongoing." As Oliver spoke, Sage could see the problem clearly. The feeling of belonging, of being part of something larger and more beautiful than herself, hadn't disappeared. It had simply become associated with a specific person and place that were no longer accessible. Oliver had convinced herself that happiness required her grandmother's apartment and her grandmother's stories, when really she needed to remember that the capacity for belonging lived within her own heart. Ember moved through her collection with patient wisdom, selecting a bubble that glowed with the soft green light of morning sun through leaves, shot through with the golden warmth of unconditional love, and the quiet security of knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be. That feeling of being part of something beautiful, Sage said quietly, of knowing that you belong not just in a place but in the world itself, of understanding that every story you've ever heard, and every story you'll ever tell, is connected to something larger and more wonderful than you can imagine. The memory bubble drifted toward Oliver like a blessing made visible, and when it touched her, her entire posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and tears of recognition rather than sadness began to flow down her cheeks. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember that the feeling wasn't about the apartment, or even about my grandmother specifically. It was about recognizing that I was part of the great story of people loving each other, of generations passing down wisdom and wonder. That feeling is still there, I just forgot how to access it." From that evening forward, Oliver became a regular visitor to the lighthouse, not as someone seeking healing, but as someone who seemed to understand intuitively the work that Sage and Ember were doing. She had her own gift for sensing emotional atmospheres, for knowing when someone needed extra gentleness or when a moment was ripe for transformation. As summer deepened into autumn and Sage's 14th birthday approached, she began to understand that Oliver's arrival in their lives was not coincidental. Ember was becoming more translucent with each passing week, and Sage realized that she was being prepared for a new phase of her calling, one that would require not just her individual gifts, but the support and understanding of someone who could walk beside her in this gentle work of helping the world remember how to shine. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the darkening water, and within its steady rhythm, Sage felt herself growing into something she had always been meant to become. Guided by a dragon whose love was becoming larger than any single form could contain, the partnership between Sage and Oliver deepened with the gentle rhythm of autumn settling over their coastal town, each golden day bringing new understanding of the delicate work they were learning to share. As October painted the lighthouse garden in shades of amber and rust, people continued to arrive with careful steps and hopeful hearts, drawn by whispered stories of healing that had begun to ripple through their community. Like warm light spreading through morning mist, Oliver had slipped into the rhythm of their work with the natural grace of someone who had always belonged there, though she couldn't quite explain how she knew when to brew extra tea or when to arrange the kitchen chairs in a circle that somehow made everyone feel safer. She possessed what she quietly called feeling maps, an ability to sense the emotional geography of a person's heart, and to understand where their joy had become blocked or buried beneath layers of protective sorrow. "I can't see what you see," Oliver explained to Sage one evening, as they watched Ember drift through the lighthouse rooms like a luminous ghost, her form now so translucent that she seemed more like warm breath than solid presence. "But I can feel where the walls are, where someone has built barriers to keep pain out, but accidentally locked happiness away too." Their first truly collaborative healing came when Margaret Walsh, the town librarian, sought them out during the week when the maple trees finally surrendered their leaves to the wind. Margaret had always been the keeper of stories for their community, but lately she had lost her ability to find wonder in the tales she tended. The books felt like mere objects to her now, their magic somehow drained away by months of bureaucratic struggles and budget cuts that had left her feeling defeated and hollow. "I used to open a book and feel like I was opening a door to infinite worlds," Margaret confessed, her hands trembling slightly around her teacup. "Now they're just paper and ink. I've forgotten how to believe in the magic of stories, and without that belief, how can I share it with the children who come to me seeking adventure?" Sage felt Ember stir beside her, the dragon's presence now so ethereal that she existed more as warmth and wisdom than visible form. But her collection of joy bubbles remained as vibrant as ever, floating like gentle lanterns near the kitchen ceiling, each one holding a perfect moment of wonder, preserved in shimmering clarity. Oliver leaned forward slightly, her sensitivity immediately mapping the emotional landscape of Margaret's inner world. "It's like someone has built a wall between you and your sense of wonder," she said softly. "The magic is still there, but you can't reach it because you've convinced yourself it isn't real anymore." "Tell me about the first story that made you believe in magic," Sage asked. Guided by Ember's gentle wisdom flowing through her awareness, like honey dissolving in warm tea, Margaret's eyes grew distant with remembering, her breathing becoming deeper as she reached back through decades of literary love. "I was 7 years old, and my grandmother read me The Secret Garden during a long illness. As she spoke, I could see the hidden door in the wall, could smell the roses blooming after years of neglect. I felt like I was discovering that secret garden myself. Like every book held the possibility of finding something beautiful that had been waiting just for me." As Margaret spoke, Sage watched Ember move through her collection with the patient wisdom of someone who understood that healing required perfect timing. The dragon selected a bubble that glowed with the soft green light of growing things, shot through with golden threads of discovery and the pure joy of finding beauty in unexpected places. But this time, Oliver's gift proved essential. As the memory bubble began to drift toward Margaret, Oliver reached out with her ability to sense emotional barriers, gently clearing a path through the walls of cynicism and disappointment that had grown around the librarian's heart. It was like watching someone carefully remove fallen branches from a stream, allowing water to flow freely for the first time in months. When the bubble of rediscovered wonder touched Margaret, the transformation was immediate and profound. Her posture straightened, her eyes brightened with unshed tears of recognition, and a smile spread across her face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I remember," she whispered, her voice thick with rediscovered magic. "I remember that every book is a doorway, every story an invitation to believe in something larger and more beautiful than what we can see with our ordinary eyes. The magic was never in the books themselves. It was in my willingness to step through the doorway they offered." From that day forward, Margaret's library became a place of renewed enchantment. Children would linger after story time, reluctant to leave the spell she wove with her words, and adults would find themselves checking out books they hadn't considered in years, drawn by the librarian's infectious rediscovery of literary wonder. As autumn deepened toward winter, and Sage's 15th birthday approached, she began to understand that Oliver's arrival in their lives had been no coincidence. Ember was becoming more translucent with each passing week, her edges so soft now that she seemed to exist more as presence than form, and Sage realized she was being prepared for a new phase of her calling, one that would require not just her individual gifts, but the support and understanding of someone who could walk beside her in this gentle work. "We're like two parts of the same bridge," Oliver observed one evening as they cleaned up after their last visitor of the day. "I can sense where the blockages are, and you can see what needs to be returned. Together, we can help people in ways that neither of us could manage alone." The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the darkening water, and within its steady rhythm, Sage felt herself growing into something she had always been meant to become, not just a keeper of individual treasures, but part of a larger network of healing that was beginning to spread through their community like light, carried from candle to candle, each flame making the next one possible. Through the kitchen window, she could see the warm glow of houses where people were rediscovering their capacity for joy, where forgotten laughter was being remembered, where the simple magic of being human and connected was being restored one gentle healing at a time. And in that soft constellation of renewed light, Sage understood that Ember's transformation was not an ending, but a beginning. The dragon's love becoming so vast that it could no longer be contained in a single form, but was spreading out to become part of the very fabric of their world. The gentle constellation of renewed light that had begun spreading through their coastal town continued to grow as winter settled over the lighthouse like a soft blanket of possibility. Word traveled not as gossip, but as something more profound, a whispered understanding that healing was available, that the lighthouse keeper's daughter and her quiet friend could help people remember pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. It was Oliver who suggested they begin hosting what she called listening evenings, small gatherings where people could sit together without needing to explain everything at once. They arranged Elena's quilts in a circle, set out bowls of clementines and plates of simple sandwiches cut into triangles, and let the lighthouse kitchen become a sanctuary where stories could unfold at their own pace. The first circle was hesitant, just 3 people besides Sage and Oliver. The second was not. By February, they were gently turning people away, not from lack of compassion, but from the understanding that healing required intimate space. During these evenings, Sage began to notice something profound happening. She was no longer just helping individuals recover their lost joys. She was teaching others to become keepers of light themselves. The realization came gradually, like dawn spreading across water, but it changed everything about how she understood her calling. Ember's continued transformation made this evolution both possible and necessary. The dragon had become so translucent that she existed more as warmth and wisdom than visible form, her collection of joy bubbles floating freely through the lighthouse like gentle stars that had forgotten they were supposed to stay in the sky. When Sage reached out to touch her beloved friend, her hand passed through what felt like the sweetest memory of comfort, present but no longer solid. "I'm becoming something larger," Ember explained during one of their evening conversations, her voice now coming from everywhere at once, like wind through seagrass. "All the love I've collected, all the joy I've preserved. It's growing beyond what any single form can contain. Soon I'll be part of the very air you breathe, part of the light that guides people home. But first, you must learn to guide others as I have guided you." The first student appeared during a February snowfall. Anna, a young nurse from the regional hospital, arrived with wind-reddened cheeks and eyes that had forgotten how to soften. She held herself carefully, like a jar filled too close to the brim. "I'm drowning in other people's pain," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I absorb everything, their fear, their grief, their desperation. I want to help, but I feel like I'm disappearing into their suffering." Sage felt Ember's gentle guidance flowing through her awareness like warm honey. This wasn't just someone seeking healing. This was someone called to become a healer herself. If she could learn to work with her gift, rather than be overwhelmed by it. "You're not a container," Sage said softly. "You're a bridge. Pain passes through you because you open for people. But bridges are meant to let things move, not stay." With Oliver mapping the emotional landscape of Anna's inner world and Ember's presence warming the space between them, Sage began teaching Anna what she called emotional alchemy, the art of consciously receiving pain, holding it with compassion, and then releasing it as something lighter. It wasn't about building walls against suffering, but about learning to transform it, to become a channel of healing rather than a reservoir of accumulated sorrow. The second student was Marcus, a quiet teenager who possessed what he fearfully called the colors, an ability to see subtle emanations around people that revealed their emotional states and spiritual health. He was terrified of his gift, convinced it meant he was going mad. "You're not broken," Sage assured him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "You're seeing another layer of reality, one that most people aren't yet ready to perceive. Your gift isn't a curse, it's a compass. It shows you where healing is needed, where joy is hidden." Through patient guidance, Sage helped Marcus understand that his visual sensitivity was actually a profound tool for service. She taught him to distinguish between different types of emotional auras, to interpret their meaning, and most importantly, to regulate his own energetic field so he wasn't constantly overwhelmed. The true test of this new teaching approach came when David Morrison, a veteran struggling with invisible wounds, sought their help. David's trauma had buried his capacity for joy so deeply that even Ember's gentle magic couldn't immediately reach it. His healing required not just Sage's individual gifts or Oliver's complementary abilities, but the combined wisdom of their entire emerging community. Anna used her empathic abilities to help David feel safe enough to begin opening the protective barriers around his heart. Marcus employed his visual sensitivity to identify where the deepest wounds were hidden. Oliver mapped the emotional landscape with her feeling maps, while Sage carefully selected the smallest, most basic moments from Ember's collection, not grand celebrations that might feel foreign to David's current reality, but simple human contentments, like the warmth of shared coffee, or the quiet satisfaction of completing a difficult task. It took months, but gradually, David began to remember how to feel from the inside out. His healing became a community effort, with Mrs. Patterson offering her rediscovered grace, Tom Bradley sharing his recovered wonder, and Margaret contributing her restored belief in the magic of stories. Each person's individual healing had created a network of support that made even the most challenging restoration possible. How do you find light in people when they can't find it themselves? David asked during one of their final sessions, his eyes now holding genuine warmth alongside the shadows he would always carry. Sage looked toward where Ember's presence warmed the air. Though the dragon was now so translucent, she existed more as feeling than form. "I don't find it," she said softly. "It was always there. We just help people remember where they put it, and sometimes we help clear away the things that are blocking their view." As spring returned to their coastal town, Sage understood that her work had entered a new phase entirely. She was no longer just a keeper of individual treasures, but a teacher in the oldest sense, someone who reminds others of what they already know, who helps activate what's already within them. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the water, and within its steady rhythm, Sage felt herself becoming part of something larger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined, a living web of connection that was transforming their entire community, one gentle healing at a time. Through the kitchen window, she could see the warm glow of houses, where people were not just rediscovering their own capacity for joy, but learning to help others do the same. And in that soft constellation of renewed and multiplying light, Sage understood that Ember's transformation was not an ending, but a beginning. The dragon's love becoming so vast that it could no longer be contained in a single form, but was spreading out to become part of the very fabric of their world, carried forward by every person who learned to see with the eyes of love. The living web of connection that had begun to transform their coastal community continued to strengthen as autumn deepened into winter, each person touched by healing, becoming a gentle beacon for others seeking their own path back to joy. But it was during these quiet months that Sage began to experience the most profound changes of all, not just in her work, but in the very fabric of her being. The shifts came gradually, like tide pools filling with morning light. Sometimes, when she was helping someone recover a particularly buried treasure of memory, Sage would feel herself becoming translucent, her consciousness gently expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical form. She could sense her presence reaching out to touch lives she had never met, carrying comfort to places she had never been. A woman in a hospital room 3 towns over would suddenly feel a gentle warmth settling over her like the softest blanket. A child afraid of the dark would sense a protective presence that helped him remember how brave he could be. "You're beginning to understand," Ember whispered during one of their evening conversations, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere, like wind carrying messages from just beyond the edge of ordinary awareness. The dragon had become so ethereal that she existed as pure warmth and wisdom, her collection of joy bubbles floating freely through the lighthouse like gentle stars that had forgotten they belonged to any particular constellation. These moments of expanded awareness both thrilled and frightened Sage. She was 19 now, no longer the child who had first seen dragons dancing around her cradle, but she still felt unprepared for the magnitude of what seemed to be unfolding within her. The work that had begun as simple conversations with an invisible friend was evolving into something that touched the very fabric of reality itself. It was Oliver who helped her understand what was happening. He had developed his own sensitivity over the years, his ability to map emotional landscapes becoming so refined that he could sense the subtle changes in Sage's presence even when she wasn't fully aware of them. Herself. "You're becoming what Ember always was," he said one evening as they sat in the lighthouse kitchen, sharing tea and watching the winter stars emerge through the frost-touched windows, a bridge between the human and the divine, between individual experience and universal love. "But you're doing it as a human being, which means you get to keep all the parts of yourself that make you who you are." Sage felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of truth. She could feel Ember's presence everywhere now, in the gentle sway of the curtains, in the warmth of the tea, in the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. The dragon hadn't disappeared. She had become woven into the very fabric of existence itself, and somehow, impossibly, Sage was becoming part of that same fabric. The realization brought both wonder and responsibility. When Anna came to her with news that she had spontaneously helped a patient recover a memory of his daughter's laughter, Or when Marcus reported that he had somehow guided a lost tourist back to safety, using nothing but his intuitive sense of direction. Sage understood that the network of healing they had created was becoming something far more profound than any of them had imagined. We're not just individual healers anymore, she told. In their small circle during one of their weekly gatherings, we're becoming part of something larger, a living web of compassion that can respond to need wherever it arises. Ember's transformation isn't separate from our own growth. We're all becoming more than we were, more connected, more capable of carrying light to places that need it most. The true test of this understanding came during the February storms, when old Mrs. Henley from the far end of town suffered a heart attack during the worst blizzard in decades. The roads were impassable, the phone lines were down, and she was completely alone in her cottage with no way to call for help. Later, Mrs. Henley would tell everyone who would listen about the impossible warmth that had surrounded her during those frightening hours, the sense of invisible hands helping her stay calm, the feeling that she was being held by something infinitely gentle and protective until the storm passed and help could finally reach her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew with absolute certainty that she hadn't been alone. Sage had felt the call that night, a sudden knowing that someone needed her, and without fully understanding how, she had reached out with her expanding consciousness to offer what comfort she could. She hadn't left the lighthouse physically, but some essential part of her had traveled through the storm to sit with a frightened woman and remind her that she was loved, that she belonged to a community that would never abandon her. That help was coming even when it seemed impossible. "How did you know?" Oliver asked the next morning when news of Mrs. Henley's rescue reached them. "I felt her fear," Sage said simply. "And I remembered what Ember taught me, that love shared is love multiplied, that healing is always available to anyone who needs it, anywhere they might be. I'm not sure how I did it, but I know it was real." As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, Sage understood that her calling had entered a new phase entirely. She was no longer just helping individuals recover their lost joys. She was becoming a living bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, a permanent reminder that magic was real and available to anyone who chose to believe in it. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the water, and within its steady rhythm, Sage felt herself growing into something she had always been meant to become, not just a keeper of treasures, but a living embodiment of the love that connected all things, a gentle guardian of the light that made life worth living. Through the kitchen window, she could see the warm glow of houses, where people were not just rediscovering their own capacity for joy, but learning to share that capacity with others. And in that soft constellation of multiplying light, Sage knew that Ember's greatest teaching was finally being fulfilled, that love, when truly understood, became too vast to be contained in any single form, but spread out to become part of the very air they breathed, the light that guided them home, the eternal promise that no one had to carry their darkness alone. The understanding that she had become a living bridge between worlds settled into Sage's daily rhythm like morning light finding its way through familiar windows. As winter softened toward spring, she watched their small coastal community continue its gentle transformation, each person touched by healing, becoming a quiet beacon for others who were still searching for their way back to joy. Mrs. Henley's recovery had left ripples that spread through the town like warmth from a hearth. Her simple thank you note, tucked beside the kitchen kettle, had become a treasured reminder that love could travel through storms and darkness to reach anyone who needed it. More importantly, her story had given others permission to believe that impossible comfort was possible, that invisible hands might reach out to hold them during their own moments of greatest need. Oliver had begun what he quietly called the Light Log, a simple leather-bound book where people could record the moments they had remembered, the joys they had recovered. The entries were brief and achingly human, the sound my mother made when she recognized me again, the way rain looks on the bay when I'm not hurrying, the first bite of a sandwich after coming home from the hospital. Each page held proof that healing was not just possible, but happening, one gentle restoration at a time. The small circles that had begun in their lighthouse kitchen were now blooming throughout the community like wildflowers, finding their own perfect places to grow. Margaret had cleared a corner of the library for evening gatherings, setting out chairs in a gentle half-moon and leaving a single lamp burning like a beacon for anyone who needed to sit in the company of others who understood that some wounds could only heal in the presence of patient witnesses. Anna had started inviting her fellow nurses to her small apartment after difficult shifts, brewing tea in her grandmother's dented kettle and teaching them the emotional alchemy Sage had shown her. How to receive pain without drowning in it. How to transform suffering into something that could be released rather than carried indefinitely. These were not formal meetings but gatherings of the heart, where people could speak the truths they carried and find them held with infinite gentleness. Marcus, now comfortable with his gift for seeing the emotional auras that surrounded people, had quietly begun holding space for other young people who experienced the world more intensely than seemed normal. They met in the youth room above the community center, sharing the particular challenges of being sensitive in a world that often felt too bright, too loud, too overwhelming. Under Marcus's gentle guidance, they learned to see their sensitivity not as a burden, but as a compass, pointing them toward where healing was most needed. Sage moved among these expanding circles like a gentle breeze that made curtains stir without disturbing the peace of a room. She could feel Ember's presence everywhere now, woven into the very fabric of their community, accessible to anyone who remembered how to look with the part of their eyes that still believed in magic. The dragon's collection of joy bubbles had dispersed throughout their entire town, becoming part of the air they breathed, the light that filtered through spring leaves, the warmth that gathered in spaces where people chose to be kind to one another. The true test of this community-wide transformation came during their annual Spring Festival, an event that had grown increasingly hollow over the years as economic pressures and social divisions had drained much of the authentic celebration from what had once been a genuine gathering of neighbors. As Sage walked through the festival grounds on the morning of the event, she could sense the collective weariness, the resigned acceptance that things would never again be as magical as they once were. "It's like the whole town has forgotten how to celebrate together," Oliver observed quietly, his own sensitivity mapping the emotional landscape of their community's shared heart. Sage closed her eyes and reached out with her expanding consciousness, not to any individual person, but to the shared memory of their town, to the place where all their separate stories intersected and became one larger story of people learning to love each other despite their differences. She could sense it immediately, the buried treasure of collective joy that lay hidden beneath years of accumulated disappointment, waiting patiently like seeds in winter soil, working together with the intuitive partnership they had developed. Over years of shared service, Sage and Oliver began moving through the festival grounds, not speaking to anyone directly, but simply holding space for something beautiful to emerge. Anna helped children who had forgotten how to play with genuine delight rediscover the simple magic of games and laughter. Marcus used his visual sensitivity to offer small gestures of kindness to those carrying the heaviest burdens of disappointment. It was Mrs. Patterson who provided the catalyst for transformation. Standing behind her booth of homemade preserves, she suddenly began humming an old melody, the same waltz she had remembered during her own healing years before. The sound carried across the festival grounds like a gentle invitation, and without quite knowing why, other people began to hum along, their voices joining hers in a harmony that seemed to rise from some deep collective memory of joy. The change was subtle at first, like morning light gradually brightening a room. Conversations became warmer, laughter more genuine. Children began running between the booths with authentic excitement rather than restless energy. Adults found themselves lingering over shared meals, really listening to each other's stories instead of simply waiting for their turn to speak. The artificial divisions that had grown between different groups in town seemed to dissolve in the warmth of rediscovered connection. By afternoon, the festival had transformed into something none of them had experienced in years, a genuine celebration of community, where the simple act of being together felt like the most natural magic in the world. People who hadn't spoken in months found themselves sharing memories and making plans. Elderly residents who had felt forgotten discovered young families eager to hear their stories. As evening approached and families began reluctantly gathering their belongings, Sage felt a profound sense of completion wash over her. This was what Ember had always been preparing her for, not just individual healing, but the restoration of the connections that made healing possible in the first place. The dragon's love had become so vast that it could no longer be contained in a single form, but had spread out to become part of the very fabric of their community. Walking home under a sky dusted with stars, Oliver took her hand and squeezed gently. "I think we witnessed something entirely new today," he said softly. "Not just a healed community, but a community that knows how to heal itself." The lighthouse. Beam swept its patient arc across the water ahead of them, and within its steady rhythm, Sage could hear the echo of Ember's voice, not as memory, but as living presence. Love shared is love multiplied. Joy preserved becomes joy eternal, and every heart that learns to shine makes all the other hearts remember their own light. That night, as spring rain began to fall in gentle whispers against the lighthouse windows, Sage understood that their work had entered a new phase entirely. They were no longer just helping individuals recover their lost treasures. They were helping an entire community remember its capacity for collective joy, for shared wonder, for the kind of love that made ordinary moments feel like quiet miracles. The rain continued through the night, washing the world clean and preparing the earth for whatever seeds of possibility tomorrow might bring. And in the lighthouse kitchen, the light log waited on its shelf, ready to receive new stories of recovered joy, new proof that healing was not a rare gift, but a natural expression of people choosing to care for one another with infinite gentleness and patient hope. The gentle rain that had blessed their spring festival continued through the night, washing the world clean and carrying with it something even more profound than celebration, the quiet understanding that healing had taken root in ways none of them had fully anticipated. As morning arrived soft and silver, Sage woke to find that the light log had somehow grown overnight, new entries appearing in margins and between pages, as if people had come in the darkness to leave small thank yous and careful truths written in trembling hands. The notes were humble and achingly human. I remembered my father's whistle when he came home from night shifts. I tasted strawberries the way they used to taste when I was 7. I forgave myself for the day I didn't know how to be kinder. Each entry carried the faint warmth of recovered joy, proof that Ember's dispersed collection was finding its way to hearts that needed exactly what they had lost. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to unfold. Reports reached them from neighboring towns, carried by travelers and merchants who spoke with wonder of inexplicable moments of healing they had witnessed. A baker in the next village, Over had suddenly remembered his grandfather's secret ingredient, inspiring him to revive recipes that had been sleeping in his heart for decades. Children in a coastal town 30 miles north had spontaneously begun tending an abandoned garden, transforming it into such a place of beauty that adults would detour past it just to feel their spirits lift. "It's spreading," Oliver observed. One evening, as they read letters that had begun arriving from people they had never met, each message told a similar story: moments of unexpected grace, recovered memories of love, sudden understanding that healing was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Sage nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate through her expanding awareness. She could sense herself changing, becoming less individual and more woven into the fabric of everything around her. Sometimes, when she was deeply engaged in helping someone, her consciousness would gently expand beyond the boundaries of her physical body, reaching out to touch lives far beyond their small town. A child facing loneliness in a distant city might suddenly feel inexplicable warmth. A person struggling with a difficult decision might experience a moment of profound clarity, as if gentle hands had brushed away the fog of confusion. The most significant test of this evolution came when Rena arrived, a music teacher from an inland town carrying grief like a shadow that had forgotten how to be small. She sat at their kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she barely touched, and the first thing she said was achingly simple. "I don't want you to take my sorrow away. It belongs to my little boy. I just want to remember the parts of myself that can still breathe without him." There are moments when healing is less about returning joy and more about honoring love transformed by loss. Sage felt Ember's presence gather around them like the softest shawl, not offering solutions, but simply holding space for the sacred weight of a mother's love that death could not diminish. "Tell me what he loved," Sage said gently, her voice carrying the patience of someone who understood that some treasures were too precious to rush. Rena began with small things, sandwiches cut into star shapes, the sound of rain on windows, and the way he would whisper, "Listen," like the weather was performing just for them, a song he had made up about a dragon who collected blue buttons and pieces of clouds. With each memory, the room filled with the luminous presence of a child whose life had been brief but incandescent. When Sage finally reached for what remained of Ember's collection, what came forward was unlike the bright spheres of uncomplicated happiness she usually offered. This treasure held the gentle gold of candlelight and the deep blue of midnight water, a kind of joy that had learned to coexist with grief without being diminished by it. "Not to replace him," Sage said, cradling the memory like something infinitely fragile, "but to remember that the part of you that sang with him is still here. That music didn't leave, it just changed rooms. When the healing touched Rena, she didn't smile. That would have been the wrong measure. Instead, her breathing deepened, her shoulders lowered just slightly, and she looked toward the sea as if she could hear a melody in the water that only she and one small boy would ever truly know. "I can't do sunlight yet," she whispered, "but I can do dawn." It was during these same weeks that Luna appeared at their door, a child of perhaps 7 with eyes that held ancient wisdom and an easy familiarity with invisible companions. Her worried parents explained that Luna insisted on visiting the place where dragons learned to fly, and as Sage watched the little girl have animated conversations with what appeared to be empty air, she understood that they were witnessing something entirely new. "She sees them everywhere," Luna's mother said quietly. "Not just one dragon, but dozens of them. She says they're all connected, like a family that stretches across the whole world." "What do they tell you?" Sage asked, kneeling to meet Luna's bright, serious gaze. "They say you taught them how to become bigger," Luna replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess when discussing the impossible. "How to spread out so they could help more people, and they say there are children being born all over who can see them naturally, who won't need to learn like you did because they'll already know." The implications settled over Sage like the gentlest revelation. She was witnessing the next stage of human evolution, children born with abilities that surpassed even her own, young ones who could work with healing energies as naturally as breathing, who understood intuitively that the invisible world of love and magic was woven seamlessly through ordinary reality. As autumn returned and more children like Luna found their way to the lighthouse, Sage began to understand that her role was evolving once again. She was becoming not just a healer, but a kind of translator, helping these gifted children navigate a world that wasn't yet ready to fully acknowledge their abilities, while also helping their families understand that what they were witnessing wasn't madness but the emergence of humanity's next chapter. "I think," she confided to Oliver one evening, as they walked along the beach, "that I'm beginning to understand what Ember meant about becoming something bigger. I can feel myself changing, expanding, but not losing what makes me human. It's like love itself is learning new ways to express itself through us." Oliver squeezed her hand, his own sensitivity having grown refined enough to feel the dragon's presence in the warmth that radiated from Sage, in the profound peace that settled over any space she inhabited. "True love," he said softly, "isn't about holding on tight to what we know. It's about allowing transformation, trusting that what truly belongs together will find new ways to connect." Ember didn't disappear. She became more of herself. "And you're doing the same." The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the darkening water, and within its steady rhythm, Sage felt herself growing into something she had always been meant to become, not just a keeper of individual treasures, but a living bridge between worlds, a gentle guardian of the light that made existence itself feel like the most beautiful gift imaginable. Through the kitchen window, she could see the warm glow of houses where people were not just rediscovering their own capacity for joy, but learning to nurture that capacity in others, creating an ever-expanding constellation of light that stretched far beyond what any single heart could hold, yet somehow felt as intimate as a whispered lullaby shared between the closest of friends, the gentle constellation of renewed light that had begun spreading through there. Coastal community continued to grow as spring deepened into summer, each person touched by healing, becoming a quiet beacon for others who were still searching for their way back to joy. But it was during these warm months that the most profound transformation began to unfold, not just in their town, but in the very nature of what it meant to be human. Luna was only the first. Throughout the summer, more children arrived with their worried but hopeful parents, each young one carrying abilities that surpassed even Sage's own childhood gifts. There was Theo, a solemn boy with eyes the color of rain-wet slate, who could perceive what he called threads, fine lines of emotional connection that stretched between people across rooms, across towns, across the invisible distances that separated heart from heart. When he concentrated, he could see the entire web of human feeling, but the intensity often overwhelmed him until Sage taught him to carry a warm stone in his pocket, something solid and simple to anchor him when the threads became too tangled to bear. Amaya painted emotions on scraps of driftwood with nothing but water and sunlight, leaving no visible color behind, yet somehow making everyone who held her creations feel the exact shade of joy or sorrow or wonder she intended. Her gift was so subtle that adults often dismissed it as imagination. But other children would gather around her work, with the reverence usually reserved for the most precious treasures. Each child brought their own unique way of perceiving the invisible world, and Sage found herself becoming something she had never expected, a translator between dimensions of reality, helping these gifted young ones navigate their extraordinary sensitivity, while also helping their families understand that what they were witnessing wasn't madness but evolution. The lighthouse itself adapted to accommodate this new purpose, its rooms transforming from Elena's cozy kitchen and Marcus's quiet study into gentle sanctuaries for exploration and discovery. This wasn't a formal school. These children needed no curriculum to teach them what they already knew in their bones. Instead, it became a place where their gifts were not only understood but celebrated, where they could learn to integrate their expansive awareness with the practical necessities of living in a world that was still catching up to their natural abilities. Working together, Sage and Oliver developed what they called the 3 gentle rules, and not commandments, but lullabies to help the children stay grounded. First, everything begins by coming back to the body. Take a bite of something simple, hold a warm stone, feel your feet on the floor. Second, name what you feel only if it grows lighter when you do. Third, ask permission, not just of people, but of memories, of rooms, of the quiet itself. The children learned these practices with the easy grace of people remembering, rather than studying. When Theo became overwhelmed in the crowded market, feeling too many emotional threads at once, Luna would appear beside him, humming a tune that sounded like a hallway finding its way to a door, while Sage guided his attention back to simple, solid things: orange, stone, your own breath. The crisis would pass, the overwhelming input would settle, and Theo would smile with the relief of someone who had learned to navigate a gift rather than be conquered by it. But perhaps the most beautiful development was what became known as the Garden of Returned Things. Each child planted something in the lighthouse garden, not a memory itself, but an object that reminded them of a treasure they had helped restore. Luna pressed a smooth blue button into the soil for the dragon who collected such things. Theo planted a broken shoelace for all the times he had learned to tie and untie what seemed impossible. Amaya buried a small jar of seawater to honor feelings that had nowhere to live, until they were given a little room to breathe. Oliver hung a tiny bell under the rosemary bush, and it would ring on days when no wind moved, a silver sound so fine you heard it more with your chest than your ears. It rang whenever someone nearby remembered a joy they hadn't meant to forget, creating a gentle soundtrack for the daily miracles of recovered wonder. The true test of their evolving community came during the fierce winter storm that damaged the main bridge, leaving them isolated for nearly a week. But instead of panic or hoarding, something extraordinary happened. The children who had been learning to work with their natural gifts began spontaneously organizing what Luna called comfort circles, moving through the community in small groups, somehow knowing exactly which houses held people struggling with fear or loneliness. Mrs. Patterson opened her store's emergency supplies to anyone who needed them. Tom Bradley and the other fishermen pooled their preserved catches, creating communal meals that somehow stretched to feed everyone. Margaret transformed the library into a warming center, where families gathered to share stories and hot tea brewed over camping stoves. The children's presence alone seemed to ease anxiety, their natural ability to see and work with emotional energy, creating pockets of peace in the midst of uncertainty. "It's like the whole town has remembered how to be a family," Anna observed. "Not the kind related by blood, but the kind that chooses to take care of each other, because that's what love looks like in action." During these same weeks, Sage began experiencing what she could only describe as distributed presence. Moments when her consciousness existed simultaneously in multiple places, offering comfort to strangers she had never met while remaining fully present in her own life. She might be teaching Luna to distinguish between different types of invisible companions, when suddenly she would also be sitting with a grieving father in a distant hospital, her presence offering exactly the comfort he needed to remember that love persists beyond physical form. "I don't understand how it works," she confided to Oliver during one of their evening walks. "I'm completely here with you, but I'm also somehow there with people I've never met, offering exactly what they need in their moment of greatest difficulty." Eleanor, with the intuitive wisdom of someone who had watched her daughter grow from a child who saw dragons to a young woman becoming something unprecedented, touched Sage's cheek gently one evening. "You're thinner at the edges," she murmured, not with worry but with knowing. It wasn't a vanishing. It was more like a shoreline learning new shapes after a kind storm. As autumn returned and the first anniversary of their winter storm approached, Sage felt herself standing at the threshold of another transformation. The work that had begun with a small girl talking to an invisible dragon was becoming something that touched the very evolution of human consciousness itself. She could sense a vast network of connections spreading across the world, other communities where similar work was happening, other individuals who had learned to work with healing energies, other children born with natural abilities that previous generations had forgotten were possible. "The dragons say this is what they've always been working toward," Luna told her one evening as they watched the lighthouse beam sweep its patient arc across the water. "Not just helping individual people, but helping all the people remember they're really one big family that got confused about how to love each other." The tiny bell in the rosemary bush rang for no wind at all, silver and sure. Somewhere a father remembered the whistle he thought he'd lost. Somewhere a grandmother felt her hands fill again with the bread she taught herself to make before anyone called it a recipe. Somewhere a teacher paused at the classroom door and asked softly, "Are you ready?" And the room answered back in the way rooms do, "We are." Through the kitchen window, Sage could see the warm glow of houses where people were learning to live as if love were the most natural force in the universe, as if caring for one another were as instinctive as breathing. And in that soft constellation of awakening hearts, she felt Ember's presence not as memory, but as living reality, woven into every act of kindness, every moment of recovered joy, every choice to see the world through the eyes of love rather than fear. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal promise to guide travelers safely home, and within its steady rhythm, Sage understood that her calling was entering its most profound phase yet. She was becoming not just a bridge between worlds, but a living embodiment of the love that connected all beings, preparing for a transformation that would ask her to keep everything she cherished, while allowing it to become something infinitely larger, infinitely more beautiful than any single heart could hold. Alone, the understanding that she had become a living bridge between worlds settled into Sage's daily rhythm, like morning light finding its way through familiar windows. But with this profound realization came new challenges that required wisdom she was still learning to access. As autumn deepened and the children's gifts continued to flourish under her guidance, Sage began to notice something that both humbled and concerned her. The work was growing faster than any of them could sustain alone. Letters arrived daily now, not just from neighboring towns, but from places she had never heard of, each one carrying the careful hope of people who had heard whispers of healing and wondered if such things might be possible for them too. Anna came to her one evening after a particularly difficult shift at the hospital, her hands trembling as she set down her teacup, and the words that tumbled out carried the weight of someone who had been trying to be everything to everyone. "I absorbed too much today," Anna confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, A child who couldn't stop crying, a man dying alone, 3 families receiving terrible news all at once. I wanted to help them all, and I think I tried to carry their pain for them, instead of helping them carry it themselves. Now I feel like I'm drowning in sorrows that aren't even mine. Sage felt Ember's presence stir around them, no longer visible but woven into the very air they breathed, and with that familiar warmth came understanding that felt both ancient and immediate. "We can't be containers," she said gently, reaching across the table to still Anna's trembling hands. "Containers fill up and eventually overflow or break. We have to learn to be like riverbanks instead, shaping the flow, guiding the current, touching the water without trying to hold it all." This conversation became the seed of what Sage would later call her most important teaching, the art of sustainable service. Over the following weeks, she began working not just with individuals seeking healing, but with the healers themselves, helping them understand that their own well-being was not separate from their ability to serve others, but the very foundation that made genuine service possible. Oliver, whose quiet wisdom had deepened through years of witnessing impossible transformations, suggested they establish what he called a Sabbath of light, one evening each week, when no one in their community would ask for healing and no one would offer it. Instead, they would gather simply to be together, sharing simple meals and comfortable silence, reading favorite passages from beloved books, and remembering that they were human beings first, healers second. The first such gathering felt awkward, people fidgeting as if waiting for something significant to happen. But by the 4th week, the stillness had begun to feel like water finding its natural level. Even the children seemed grateful for an evening when they didn't need to be remarkable, when they could simply exist without the weight of their extraordinary gifts, requiring constant attention. During one of these peaceful evenings, as they sat in Elena's warm kitchen sharing soup and sandwiches cut into triangles, the tiny bell in the rosemary bush rang twice with no wind to stir it, and someone laughed, a sound so pure and unforced that it seemed to bless the entire gathering. Sage realized that this simple practice was creating space for joy to return naturally, without anyone working to make it happen. The true test of these new understandings came during what Luna would later call the night of many tears. 3 crises struck their community simultaneously. Mrs. Patterson collapsed at her store, her heart struggling under accumulated stress. Tom Bradley's fishing boat was caught in a sudden squall, leaving him stranded on dangerous rocks, and the power failed at the nursing home during a winter storm, leaving elderly residents frightened in the cold darkness. In the past, Sage would have felt torn, forced to choose where to focus her attention. But now, drawing on the sustainable practices they had been developing, she found herself able to respond to all 3 situations at once. Part of her consciousness sat with Mrs. Patterson in the ambulance, offering exactly the comfort needed to keep her heart steady. Another aspect of her awareness guided the rescue team to Tom's location, through intuitive knowing that transcended ordinary navigation. Meanwhile, her presence filled the nursing home with warmth that had nothing to do with electricity, helping residents remain calm until power could be restored. But what made this possible was not just her expanded abilities, it was the network of support they had built together. Anna coordinated the medical response with calm efficiency, drawing on her training in emotional alchemy to remain clear-headed under pressure. Marcus used his visual sensitivity to help the rescue team navigate safely through the storm. Oliver organized practical support for families affected by the crisis, while the children, led by Luna, moved through the community, offering exactly the kind of comfort that only they could provide. "How are you doing this?" Anna asked afterward, her voice filled with wonder rather than disbelief. "I could feel your presence during the crisis, but you were also completely here with us. I think," Sage said slowly, still processing the evening's events, "that love is learning new ways to express itself through all of us. I'm not doing this alone. We're all becoming part of something larger, a living web of compassion that can respond wherever it's needed most." This understanding led to the establishment of what they called response circles, small groups trained not just in healing techniques, but in the practices that would allow them to serve sustainably over decades. Sage taught them to begin each day by checking in with their own emotional and physical state, to set clear boundaries around what they could offer without depleting themselves, and to end each day by consciously releasing whatever they had absorbed, returning it to the larger flow of life, rather than carrying it indefinitely. True healers, she would explain to these expanding circles, are not martyrs or saints. They're ordinary people who have learned to take care of themselves so well that they naturally overflow with love and healing for others. The goal is not to sacrifice yourself for others, but to become so full of life and joy that you can't help but share it. When a letter arrived from a mountain town asking for help with their collective grief following a mining accident, Sage's response surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of immediately packing to travel there, she called together their entire network to consider how they might offer their best assistance without anyone sacrificing their own well-being. The solution they developed was both practical and revolutionary. Anna and Marcus would travel as the primary responders, carrying with them not just their individual gifts, but the collective wisdom of their entire community. Margaret would send carefully chosen books and stories. Tom would share recordings of the sea and photographs of sunrise over water. Sage would offer her distributed presence each evening at a specific time, creating a bridge of comfort that could be felt even across great distances. The reports that came back over the following weeks spoke of gentle miracles. A widow who began singing again, children who remembered how to play without fear, a community that rediscovered its capacity to support one another through the darkest times. But perhaps most importantly, the team that had traveled returned energized rather than depleted, having learned to give from their fullness rather than their emptiness. As winter gave way to spring, Sage understood that her transformation was not about becoming something other than human, but about becoming more fully human than she had ever imagined possible. She could feel her consciousness expanding to touch lives around the world. But this expansion was rooted in the most ordinary joys. Oliver's hand warm in hers, her mother's quiet humming as she tended the garden, the children's laughter echoing through the lighthouse rooms, the simple pleasure of sharing meals with people she loved. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the water, and within its steady rhythm, Sage felt herself becoming what Ember had always been, not a distant guardian but an intimate presence, woven into the fabric of daily life, reminding everyone who encountered her that magic was real, that healing was possible, and that love, when truly understood, became too vast to be contained in any single form, but spread out to become part of the very air they breathed, the light that guided them home, the eternal promise that no one had to carry their darkness alone. Through the kitchen window, she could see the warm glow of houses where people were learning not just to heal, but to live in ways that made healing unnecessary, with kindness as their default setting, with wonder as their natural response to the world, with love as the lens through which they viewed every person they encountered. And in that soft constellation of awakening hearts, Sage knew that Ember's greatest teaching was finally being fulfilled, that joy shared multiplied infinitely, that healing became contagious when offered with genuine care, and that every person who learned to see with the eyes of love became a dragon themselves, a keeper of light, a guardian of the treasures that made life worth living, the gentle understanding that healing could be shared without being depleted, continued to ripple through their coastal community as summer deepened into the golden weeks of early autumn. What had begun as careful experiments in sustainable service now flowed with the natural rhythm of tide and season, each person touched by their work becoming not just healed, but a healer in their own quiet way. Oliver had begun creating what he called lighthouse parcels, simple packages that somehow carried more comfort than their contents should have been able to hold. Each parcel contained a smooth stone warmed between his hands, a small card with the 3 gentle rules written in Elena's careful script, a page from the light log with names removed, but feelings left intact, and one of his mother's recipes for sandwiches that somehow always tasted like kindness made edible. He sent these wherever letters asked for help, and they traveled farther than anyone expected, crossing borders as easily as good news travels between friends. "People are starting to call what we do by a name," Margaret mentioned one evening as they prepared another batch of parcels. "They're calling it the Lighthouse Way." Sage smiled at that, feeling both gratitude and gentle caution. "Let the name live in their hearts, not on any signs," she said softly. "If it helps them remember their own light, then it's served its purpose." The children, now young adults, had grown into their extraordinary gifts with the natural grace of flowers turning towards sun. Luna, at 19, could perceive what she called the great weaving, the way individual acts of kindness created patterns that stretched across continents, connecting strangers through invisible threads of shared compassion. When she concentrated, she could see the entire network of healing that had grown from their small lighthouse, spreading like mycelium through the world's hidden soil. Theo had learned to work with his sensitivity to emotional threads without being overwhelmed by them. He could now sense when someone thousands of miles away was struggling with loneliness, and somehow, through the network they had built together, offer exactly the comfort needed in that moment. Hamaya painted with colors that existed only in the realm of feeling, creating artworks that could heal trauma simply by being witnessed with an open heart. Most remarkably, these young people were beginning to work together in ways that suggested human consciousness itself was evolving. When reports reached them of a devastating earthquake in a distant mountain region, the children spontaneously linked their awareness, creating what Luna called a circle of light that could reach across any distance to offer comfort and hope. Sage watched these developments with wonder and deep recognition. At 25, she could feel her own consciousness continuing to expand, but always in service of connection rather than power. Sometimes, when she was helping someone recover a particularly buried treasure of memory, she would sense her presence simultaneously touching lives she had never met. A grieving mother in a city hospital, a frightened child during a thunderstorm, an elderly man who had forgotten how to hope. The true test of their evolving network came during what would later be remembered as the Week of Many Needs. Natural disasters struck 3 different regions simultaneously, floods in one area, wildfires in another, and a severe storm that left entire communities isolated and afraid. In the past, such widespread suffering would have felt overwhelming, impossible to address with their gentle methods, but something extraordinary happened. The network of healers, teachers, and gifted young people that had grown around their lighthouse began spontaneously connecting their consciousness, creating what felt like a living web of compassion that could respond wherever love was most urgently needed. Sage found herself at the heart of this web, not as a leader, but as a focal point through which healing energy could flow to wherever it was most needed. For 7 days, she existed simultaneously in multiple locations, sitting with families trapped by rising water, offering strength to exhausted rescue workers, providing comfort to children separated from their parents. But she was never alone in this work. Anna's gift for emotional alchemy flowed through the network, helping traumatized survivors process their experiences. Marcus used his visual sensitivity to guide rescue efforts toward people who might otherwise have been missed. The children worked together to create pockets of peace in the midst of chaos. Oliver documented these events in his careful way, not as miracles, but as natural expressions of love, learning new ways to manifest. His resonant maps showed how a single act of kindness in their lighthouse kitchen could inspire similar acts thousands of miles away, creating patterns of connection that defied ordinary understanding of cause and effect. When the immediate crises passed and the network of consciousness gently separated back into individual awareness, their entire community had been transformed by the experience. They had discovered that love, when truly shared, became infinite, that giving from the heart created more capacity rather than less, that healing others was inseparable from healing oneself. "We're not separate people who sometimes connect," Sage explained to a gathering of visitors who had come seeking to understand their work. "We're expressions of one love that has learned to experience itself through many different forms. The dragon that taught me this truth didn't disappear. She became part of everything we do, everyone we touch, every moment when someone remembers how to hope." As autumn deepened toward winter, they established what they called the Living Network, a conscious community of healers and teachers who remained connected through bonds of love while maintaining their individual lives and unique gifts. Unlike formal organizations, this network operated through what Sage described as a resonant connection, the natural tendency of people doing similar work to find and support each other. Exactly when that support was most needed, a teacher in one country would somehow know to reach out to a healer in another at precisely the moment when that connection would be most helpful. Communities separated by oceans would spontaneously develop complementary practices. Children born with extraordinary sensitivity would find their way to adults who could help them understand their gifts. Guided by currents of love that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary reality, the lighthouse itself had become more than a building. It was a symbol of the inner light that could guide anyone home to themselves, to their capacity for joy, to their unbreakable connection with all life. The beacon that swept its patient arc across the water each night now represented something far greater than physical guidance. It was a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there was always a way back to love. On the first evening of each month, people throughout their growing network would sit at the same hour, wherever they were, and touch the same sequence of simple things: a cup, a stone, their own pulse at the wrist. They would breathe together across the distances, inviting any spaces that wished to be kinder to themselves to become kinder. Without fail, the tiny bell in the rosemary bush would ring for no wind at all, and letters would later confirm the timing. Fights softening in distant kitchens, nurses pausing to offer extra comfort, strangers helping each other with unexpected grace. Through the lighthouse window, Sage could see the warm glow of houses, where people were learning to live as if love were the most natural force in the universe. The light log on its kitchen shelf had grown thick with entries, each one proof that healing was not a rare gift, but the natural result of people choosing to care for one another with infinite gentleness. As winter stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sage felt herself standing at the threshold of another transformation, not an ending, but a deepening, a preparation for the final gift she sensed she was being called to offer. The work that had begun with a child talking to an invisible dragon was becoming something that touched the very evolution of human consciousness itself. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal promise to guide travelers safely home, and within its steady rhythm, Sage understood that her greatest teaching was yet to come, a demonstration that love, when truly understood, became too vast to be contained in any single form, but spread out to become part of the very fabric of existence, available to anyone who remembered how to see with the eyes of wonder, how to touch the world with hands that had learned the secret of infinite gentleness. The understanding that her greatest teaching was yet to come settled into Sage's awareness like morning light, finding its familiar path through the lighthouse windows. As winter deepened and she approached her 30th birthday, the transformation she had sensed approaching began to manifest in ways both subtle and profound. Like tide pools filling with starlight, time itself seemed to be loosening around the edges of her perception. During their evening gatherings, when people shared stories of recovered joy and renewed hope, Sage would feel her consciousness gently expanding to encompass not just their individual experiences, but the larger pattern they were all weaving together. She could sense the invisible threads connecting each person to every other person they had touched with kindness, creating a luminous web that stretched far beyond what any single heart could hold. It was Oliver who first noticed the change, his sensitivity to emotional atmospheres having grown refined through their years of shared service. "You're becoming translucent," he observed one evening, not with worry but with the wonder of someone witnessing something unprecedented and beautiful. Not disappearing, but becoming more like light than form. Like you're learning to exist in multiple places at once. The realization was both thrilling and humbling. Sage found herself experiencing what she began to call the eternal moment, a place outside of linear time where all healing had already occurred, where all joy was permanently preserved, where all love existed in its fullest expression. Past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously, and she could perceive the spiral nature of time itself, how every moment of genuine love became eternal, available to be accessed by anyone who needed it, anywhere. And when this understanding transformed her teaching in profound ways. Instead of focusing on techniques and practices, she began helping people access this timeless space, where healing was not something to be created, but something to be remembered, not something to be earned, but something to be received. You don't have to manufacture joy, she would tell new students who arrived from increasingly distant places, drawn by whispers of someone who could help them remember their connection to the eternal source of all comfort. You just have to remove the barriers that prevent you from accessing the joy that's always been there, waiting patiently like seeds in winter soil. Together with Oliver, whose own gifts had deepened into profound empathy and wisdom, Sage began creating what they called living libraries, spaces where people could come to remember not just their own stories, but their connection to the great story of human awakening that was unfolding across the planet. These weren't rooms filled with books, but sanctuaries holding carefully chosen objects that carried stories of transformation. A smooth stone that had witnessed countless moments of courage, a piece of driftwood that held the memory of storms weathered and calms restored, a small bell that rang whenever someone nearby remembered how to hope. The most remarkable development during this time was the arrival of what Luna called the new children, young ones born with abilities that surpassed even their own extraordinary gifts. 7-year-old Iris came with parents, overwhelmed by their daughter's insistence that she could see the Council of All Joys, a gathering of beings dedicated to ensuring that happiness never disappeared entirely from the world. When Sage knelt to meet Iris's bright, serious gaze, the child smiled with immediate recognition. "Are you taught them how to become bigger?" Iris said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess when discussing the impossible. How to spread out so they could help more people. "And now you're going to do it too, but in a new way that nobody's tried before." The truth of it resonated through Sage like the deepest bell. She was being called to demonstrate a new form of evolution, one that honored both individual humanity and universal love, that maintained personal relationships while serving the collective good, that proved love could become infinite without losing its intimacy. As spring returned and the transformation began to accelerate, reports reached them from their expanding network that spoke of gentle miracles happening simultaneously across great distances. When their community gathered for their monthly touching of cup, stone, and pulse, the tiny bell in the rosemary bush would ring not just once, but in harmony with other bells, other chimes, other moments of synchronized wonder happening wherever their influence had spread. A teacher in a mountain school would pause before dismissing class and ask, "Are you ready?" And the room would answer with such complete stillness that clocks would stop ticking for one perfect breath. A nurse in a distant hospital would find herself humming a lullaby she didn't remember learning, and every patient on her ward would sleep peacefully through the night. Bakers would discover their bread rising with unusual lightness. Fishermen would find their nets filled not just with fish, but with an inexplicable sense of gratitude. And children everywhere would look up from their play to smile at invisible friends who seemed suddenly more present than ever before. Elena, with the intuitive wisdom of someone who had watched her daughter grow from a child who saw dragons to a woman becoming something beyond ordinary categories, touched Sage's cheek with infinite tenderness. "You're preparing for something beautiful, aren't you?" she whispered. "Something that will let you be everywhere love is needed, while still being here with us." The lighthouse itself seemed to respond to these changes, its rooms filling with a warmth that had nothing to do with fire or electricity. Visitors would comment on the profound peace they felt within its walls, the sense of being held by something infinitely gentle and wise. The light log had grown thick with entries from around the world, each one proof that healing was not a rare gift, but the natural result of people choosing to care for one another with infinite gentleness. During one of their evening gatherings, as the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across the water, Sage looked around at the faces of people she had come to love more than her own life. Oliver with his quiet wisdom, Luna with her gift for seeing connections, Anna with her capacity for sustainable service, Marcus with his visual sensitivity to the sacred, her parents with their unwavering support for mysteries they couldn't fully understand. "What's happening to me isn't an ending," she said, her voice carrying both the warmth of individual love and the vastness of universal compassion. "It's a completion. Everything we've learned together, every person we've helped, every moment of joy we've preserved, all of it is becoming permanent, woven into the fabric of reality itself." She paused, feeling Ember's presence more strongly than she had since childhood, not as memory but as living reality. "I'll still be here with you, but I'll also be available to anyone, anywhere, who needs to remember that love is real, that healing is possible, that magic exists in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before laughter, in the moment when someone suddenly recalls what it feels like to be completely, wonderfully alive." The lighthouse beam continued its eternal promise to guide travelers safely home, and within its steady rhythm, everyone present could feel the approaching moment when Sage would become something unprecedented, a bridge between the human and the divine that could exist in both dimensions simultaneously, offering the intimate comfort of personal love and the infinite healing of universal compassion. Through the kitchen window, they could see the warm glow of houses, where people were learning to live as if love were the most natural force in the universe. And in that soft constellation of awakening hearts, they understood that they were witnessing not just Sage's transformation, but the birth of a new possibility for human consciousness itself, the emergence of beings who could serve the collective good while maintaining their individual humanity, who could touch every heart while losing none of their capacity for personal love, who could become bridges between worlds while remaining forever, beautifully, completely human. The tiny bell in the rosemary bush rang once more, silver and sure and somewhere in the distance. Other bells answered, creating a gentle symphony of connection that stretched across continents and through dimensions, a reminder that no act of love was ever truly solitary, that every heart that learned to shine made all the other hearts remember their own light, the gentle symphony of bells that had begun with their tiny chime in the rosemary bush, continued to echo across the world as summer deepened into the golden weeks that would mark Sage's final transformation. On the evening of the summer solstice, when light lingered longest over their coastal town, people gathered in the lighthouse garden as if summoned by something deeper than invitation, a knowing that whispered in the spaces between heartbeats that something profound and beautiful was about to unfold. The garden had filled with faces both familiar and new, each person carrying their own story of healing, their own recovered treasure of joy. Mrs. Patterson sat beside Tom Bradley, both radiating the quiet contentment of people who had remembered how to dance with life itself. Margaret held court near the rosemary bush, sharing stories with Luna and the other gifted children whose eyes held the same ancient wisdom that Sage had possessed as a child. Anna and Marcus moved through the gathering like gentle shepherds, offering exactly the comfort each person needed without being asked. Oliver stood beside Sage at the center of this loving circle, his hand warm and steady in hers, his sensitivity allowing him to perceive the subtle shimmering around her, the way her edges seemed to soften, becoming more like light than form. Eleanor and Marcus watched from nearby, their faces holding the profound peace of parents who had learned to trust mysteries beyond their understanding, who had spent a lifetime witnessing their daughter become something unprecedented and beautiful. As twilight deepened into the soft blue hour when day surrenders to night, Sage looked around at the faces of people she had come to love more than her own life, feeling more present than she had ever been while simultaneously sensing her consciousness preparing to expand beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. "I want to tell you what I see," she said, her voice carrying easily across the gathering, despite speaking barely above a whisper. "I see the web of light we've woven together, stretching from this garden to every place love has been shared. I see children being born who will never doubt that magic is real, because they'll grow up in a world where enough people remember how to nurture wonder. I see communities learning to heal themselves, not through any single person's presence, but through the presence they've discovered within their own hearts." Little Iris stepped forward, her 7-year-old wisdom shining in eyes that could see far more than most adults. "The council says you're going to become like them now, but in a new way," she said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess when discussing the impossible. Not just keeping joy safe, but helping people remember they're made of joy. That it's their natural state, like breathing or having a heartbeat. Sage knelt to meet Iris's bright gaze, feeling Ember's presence gather around them like the softest shawl, not offering solutions, but simply holding space for the sacred moment of transformation. "The work doesn't end with us," she told the gathering, her form beginning to shimmer with accumulated light from decades of preserved joy. "It never ends. It just transforms, takes new forms, finds new expressions. Each person who learns to see with the eyes of love becomes a dragon themselves, a keeper of light, a guardian of the treasures that make life worth living." The transformation, when it came, was nothing like the dramatic dissolution that Ember had experienced. Instead, it was gentle, gradual, like morning light slowly filling a room. Sage remained completely visible, while simultaneously becoming something infinitely larger. She was still herself, still the lighthouse keeper's daughter who had learned to see dragons, but she was also something more, a living bridge between the human and the divine, a permanent reminder that magic was real and available to anyone who chose to believe in it. Those gathered could feel her presence expanding, touching each of them with exactly the comfort they needed most, while simultaneously reaching out to touch lives around the world. In a hospital room thousands of miles away, a lonely patient suddenly felt surrounded by love. In countless homes where people struggled with darkness, a gentle warmth settled over them like the softest blanket, reminding them that they were not alone. "I understand now," Sage said, her voice coming from everywhere at once, like wind through seagrass. "That evolution doesn't mean leaving behind what we were, but integrating it into what we're becoming. I'm still the little girl who could see dragons, still the teacher who helps others discover their gifts, but now I'm also something more, a living reminder that love is the fundamental force of the universe, that healing is always available, that every person carries within them the capacity to be a keeper of light." The lighthouse beam swept across the water, and something extraordinary happened. Instead of a single beam, the lighthouse began to emanate a gentle glow that embraced the entire horizon, a light that was somehow both soft and infinite, reaching out to guide not just ships but souls, offering comfort to anyone who needed to remember their way home to themselves. The tiny bell in the rosemary bush rang one final time, silver and sure, and the sound seemed to echo across dimensions, carrying with it the eternal promise that love, when truly understood, became too vast to be contained in any single form, but spread out to become part of the very air they breathed. The light that guided them home, the gentle presence that whispered to anyone who would listen, "You are loved. You belong. Everything is going to be okay." As the evening settled into peaceful quiet, people began to drift home along paths that knew their names, each carrying within them a piece of the light they had witnessed, ready to share it with others who needed to remember their own capacity for joy. The work continued as it always would, carried forward by ordinary people who had learned to see with extraordinary love. And somewhere, in the gentle rhythm of the waves, in the pause before laughter, in the moment when wonder transforms into wisdom, Sage's presence could be felt everywhere at once, a living reminder that no treasure of the heart was ever truly lost, that all love was eternal, that every moment of genuine joy became part of the permanent fabric of reality. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."